They ordered me to bind their lies with precision. But I saw the maps, real ones, folded inside their fabrications. So I began slipping fragments back into their pages, just enough to make someone doubt. No one noticed, not at first. But the press room grew quiet when one of them found something that shouldn't have been there. In the autumn of 1942, the city of Leipzig in central Germany thrived outwardly under the order and efficiency of the Third Reich. Its streets echoed with the heavy boots of Wehrmacht recruits. Its air hummed with the labor of printing presses churning out newspapers, military pamphlets, and meticulously crafted propaganda. Leipzig was one of the centers of the German publishing industry, home to some of the largest print houses and bookbinders in the Reich. Here, war was not fought with tanks or rifles, but with ink, paper, and ideology. The Reich Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda had ensured that Germany's cultural and intellectual infrastructure was conscripted into total war. In Leipzig, bookbinders and printers worked under directives from Berlin, producing not only the regime's internal communications but also ideological exports, pamphlets and books in French, Dutch, Danish, and English, designed to demoralize enemy troops and promote German supremacy. Each publication was a calculated instrument, engineered to instill doubt, fear, or admiration for the Nazi state. Among the thousands employed in this sprawling apparatus of print was Wilhelm Zahn, a quiet, middle-aged master bookbinder with thinning brown hair and wire-rimmed spectacles. At 46, Zahn was neither remarkable nor invisible. He was a member of the Bookbinders Guild, had earned his journeyman's certificate before the Great War, and ran a modest workstation inside one of Leipzig's subcontracted bindery shops, an anonymous cog in the larger system. He had 2 sons in uniform, one on the Eastern Front, one stationed near the Atlantic Wall. His wife, Marta, kept the home. To neighbors, Zahn was known for his punctual walk to work and his meticulous care of leather-bound tomes. His hands, trained over decades to crease, fold, and stitch with precision, now prepared editions of anti-British leaflets and bilingual informational guides, meant for distribution across enemy lines by Luftwaffe airdrops and clandestine couriers. The volumes appeared benign: travel guides, pocket dictionaries, cultural booklets. In reality, they were psychological weapons. Some urged British soldiers to lay down their arms, others claimed the Allies had abandoned certain regions to the Soviets. Zahn handled them with a craftsman's care, not a propagandist's zeal. He rarely read them. That was not his task. In the late months of 1942, a shift occurred. Orders from Berlin grew increasingly urgent and peculiar. One shipment, marked Vertraulich, confidential, was accompanied by a printed directive: the outer appearance of certain pamphlets must not reveal their German origin. Typefaces were to mimic British standards. Paper must resemble Allied issue stocks. Bookbinders were instructed to avoid any excess glue that might reveal printing origins upon inspection. Zahn noted the inconsistencies, but said little. He adjusted his technique, adhered to new specifications, and passed the finished stacks along for packing and transport. But within this layer of activity, Zahn noticed a flaw, not in the propaganda, but in its premise. Several times he observed that sections intended to mimic British publications were riddled with typesetting errors, poorly translated idioms, or absurd inaccuracies. A booklet labeled RAF Daily Procedures included naval ranks instead of Air Force ones. Another, masquerading as a pocket map for Canadian officers, displayed mislabeled railway lines and towns that had been renamed decades earlier. Zahn, who had long collected European atlases and maps as a private hobby, recognized the inaccuracies instantly. His colleagues were unaware or uninterested. The priority was volume and conformity. Quality, at least of content, was secondary. It was not Zahn's role to review the material, only to bind it, stamp it, and complete his quotas. Still, the errors disturbed him. Not because he sympathized with the British cause, he kept his political views guarded, but because such blunders reflected a larger inefficiency within the supposed machinery of the Reich. If even this department could falter in its basic facts, what else was breaking down behind closed doors? In early 1943, another pattern emerged. During one routine delivery, Zahn was asked to temporarily store several boxes of unused bindings and map sheets at his private workshop, a side business where he restored rare books for local collectors. The request came from an SS-affiliated logistics officer, pressed for space during a surprise inspection. Zahn agreed. It was not uncommon for trusted civilians to be called upon for storage during wartime. When Zahn opened one of the boxes out of curiosity, he found dozens of high-quality, unbound maps printed in English, specifically navigation maps of occupied France, Belgium, and the Low Countries. Unlike the propaganda materials he'd handled, these maps were accurate and detailed. Margins bore RAF cartographic markers. Some had creases, suggesting they had once been folded and used. These were not facsimiles or fakes. They were original Allied maps, evidently captured from downed pilots, seized intelligence drops, or confiscated during sweeps in occupied territories. Zahn replaced the contents carefully and resealed the boxes. But the encounter stayed with him. It posed questions for which he had no answers. Why were authentic Allied maps being stored in Leipzig? Why were they near propaganda production? Were they used for duplication, study, or something else entirely? In the following weeks, Zahn began to observe more such inconsistencies. A series of pamphlets destined for the Netherlands appeared to include map inserts that, unlike previous errors, were remarkably precise. Rivers, troop checkpoints, even field hospitals were marked in accurate detail. He recognized their alignment with the earlier maps. Yet they were bound into German-made propaganda pieces bearing disinformation headlines. It appeared the Reich was now embedding accurate intelligence inside misleading text, perhaps to manipulate field operations or ensnare resistant cells. The tactic was strange and risky. If caught, the Allies might realize the maps were compromised, rendering future drops suspect. But it also suggested that Nazi information operations were becoming more experimental, less predictable. Zahn, who had once viewed his work as purely mechanical, now found himself part of a web of contradictions. On one hand, he was binding texts that carried deliberate lies. On the other, he was seeing real intelligence woven into the same volumes. The lines between fabrication and fact were beginning to blur, and the consequences of such blending were uncertain. If Allied forces encountered these hybrid documents, would they believe them? Would they discard them outright? Or worse, act on the misinformation and fall into traps? Still, Zahn told no one. He carried out his duties. He filed paperwork. He trimmed spines and glued bindings. But in his private workshop, he began retaining scraps, cuttings, trimmings, and overlays discarded during misprints. A margin here, a torn fold-out map there. He told himself it was professional curiosity, a binder's interest in paper quality, a technician's instinct for record-keeping. But the pattern was clear. He was beginning to collect fragments. By the spring of 1943, Leipzig remained largely untouched by Allied bombs, but within its print houses and government-affiliated workshops, war pressure manifested in subtler forms. Tightened schedules, expanded quotas, and erratic demands issued from offices far removed from the printing floor. Wilhelm Zahn's bookbinding station, once dedicated to uniform editions of standard propaganda, was now subject to increasingly inconsistent orders. Leaflets intended for France arrived with Czech-language segments. An English-language volume bound for Belgian distribution bore Dutch spellings. And more frequently, Zahn noticed that the maps arriving in loose stacks, unbound, unlabeled, and without clear context, seemed less like copies and more like captured originals. He was careful always. If he suspected he'd seen the same map before, he verified by memory, never by notation. He made no written records. Still, the similarities were unmistakable. Terrain notations in Allied format, not German, British spellings of French cities, RF-issued reference codes lightly erased but still legible to an attentive eye. Zahn now understood that what had once been a print operation strictly for outward psychological warfare was shifting into something more complex, perhaps even an internal deception program aimed at turning Allied intelligence against itself. The accuracy of the maps implied that the German intelligence services were reproducing real Allied materials for infiltration purposes, embedding them in counterfeit guides and lost field manuals. The bookbinders, Most of them unaware of the deeper purpose, simply assembled the components as instructed. But Zahn had begun to collect fragments in quiet defiance of this ignorance. He kept only the margins, scraps trimmed during alignment, defective copies with misprinted overlays, and occasional miscuts that failed quality control. These were his justification. In the world of print work, such errors were commonplace. It was expected that a skilled binder would salvage what was usable and discard the rest. No one questioned Zahn when he wrapped these fragments in brown paper and carried them home, citing waste inventory or a need for test stitching. At home, in the cabinet beneath his work table, Zahn began organizing the clippings. Over time, they formed a crude mosaic, Allied terrain maps in original scale, annotated with pencil markings in different hands, some English, others in German script. French commune names were spelled differently across versions. Certain roads were marked in red on one sheet and black on another. By comparing these variations, Zahn began to distinguish between the authentic maps and the doctored overlays. The realization came slowly but with growing certainty. Some maps, those with certain fold patterns, coded corners, or allied fonts, were genuine. Others, despite their accuracy, bore subtle telltale signs, color discrepancies, irregular paper grain, or alignment inconsistencies around the margins. These were German reproductions. Zahn's hobby of cartographic observation had become an act of private intelligence work. Yet he still did nothing overt. He told no one. He did not attempt to interfere. He only watched. It was not until early May that the tension escalated. One of the larger workshops subcontracted by the propaganda ministry had been raided. Officially, it was a compliance inspection. Unofficially, rumors spread that a printer had been caught retaining confidential materials, possibly entire Allied volumes recovered from a resistance cache. Zahn did not know the man personally, but the incident sent a ripple of unease across Leipzig's binder and printer community. From that day forward, security was tightened. Access to certain materials was restricted. Workers were searched more frequently. And for the first time, Zahn was asked to sign a security declaration with a clause forbidding the retention of any printed fragment or confidential matter in part or whole. It was not a suggestion. That evening, Zahn burned one of his folders, an envelope containing map fragments of the Belgian Ardennes sector. He did it in his garden stove, alone. The pieces curled and flared orange before fading into soot. He retained the rest, hidden deeper within a false drawer in his basement shelves, but the message was clear. His quiet observations were no longer safe. Weeks passed. Orders resumed. But now, Zahn worked under surveillance, however informal. A Gestapo officer appeared periodically, inspecting workflows. 2 younger men were assigned to his section, ostensibly to help with binding volume, but clearly under instructions to watch. They were not unkind, but they asked questions, observed his movements, and once, accidentally, dropped his personal bag to inspect its contents. Zahn adapted. He took no more trimmings. He burned anything identifiable. His records, if they could be called that, were memorized only. It was during this period that the failures became visible. A pamphlet bound for northern France, part of a batch intended to be lost, near the front lines, was discovered days later in the wrong region, several hundred kilometers off its intended drop site. Another was reportedly intercepted by British intelligence and broadcast on the BBC as an example of crude Nazi forgery. Reports began to circulate quietly that the Allies were catching on. They were discarding found maps rather than trusting them. Some British officers were instructed to destroy field documents before capture, regardless of potential value. To Zahn, this meant only one thing. The entire operation was fraying. Not just the propaganda's reach, but its internal logic. The German reproduction maps, though technically impressive, lacked crucial Allied context, such as radio coordination symbols or field cipher patterns. Worse, they increasingly lagged behind real-world changes. A bridge marked as functional on a reproduced map had been destroyed weeks earlier by Allied sabotage. Town garrisons changed, but the forged maps did not reflect it. The result was an inadvertent trail of errors that no amount of printing precision could erase. Zahn saw the irony. The very tools he'd spent a lifetime perfecting, The binding press, the bone folder, the gluing frame were now part of a failing information war. Germany's insistence on controlling the narrative had given rise to an operation that was both technically impressive and strategically brittle. But what Zahn did not yet know, what remained concealed from even his trained eye, was that some of the maps he believed to be mere reproductions had not been intended for enemy deception at all. They had been intercepted in occupied territories, duplicated for study, and then, somehow, found their way back across enemy lines. Not as propaganda, but as reverse contraband. The lines were beginning to blur in another direction. In the summer of 1943, Leipzig's industrial rhythm persisted, though now under a nervous tempo. The Allies had intensified bombing raids across Western Germany, and while Leipzig itself remained mostly untouched, the threat of destruction hovered. Air raid drills increased. Windows were blacked out nightly. And inside the bookbinderies and print shops, a different kind of fear took root, quiet, paper-bound, and harder to define. Wilhelm Zahn had reduced his fragment collecting to a near halt. The false drawer in his basement remained sealed, untouched since spring. He had memorized what he could from the salvaged overlays and partial foldouts, then shifted his efforts towards studying what passed through his hands more subtly, without cutting, without taking. The watchfulness he'd once reserved for alignment and finish had now turned inward. Margins, watermarks, folding styles, the subtle wear patterns along creases. These told their own stories. One afternoon in July, a shipment arrived from Berlin marked with a new designation: Material für operative Verwendung, West Front. Material for operational use, Western Front. These were not the usual disinformation pamphlets or morale-targeting booklets. Inside the crate were sets of maps, printed in English, French, and German, with layered transparencies and annotations. Several bore Allied grid codes, identical to those Zahn had seen months earlier. But what stood out this time were the binding instructions. Each set was to be fastened between thin paperboard covers bearing titles like General Movement Orders and Field Supply Schedule, Quartermaster Copy. Zahn understood at once. These were not destined for Allied consumption. These were facsimiles of Allied field documents, disguised to appear as originals. But the aim was different. The covers mimicked documents that Allied officers might carry during retreat or redeployment. The content inside, precise, well-crafted, was layered with subtle errors. Road markers slightly off. Fuel depot locations altered. A supply point listed in the wrong canton. These were not meant to deceive Allied troops directly. They were intended to be found, planted in abandoned cars, faux drop zones, or among the effects of a captured courier. The goal was to mislead Allied intelligence, causing them to question their own logistics, suspect leaks, or act on poison data. The sophistication was new. And so was the risk. Zahn began to suspect that at least some of the materials he had seen before, the highly accurate maps mixed in with routine propaganda, had never been for enemy hands. They had been part of a reverse-channel operation, perhaps intended to reach resistance groups or compromised Allied liaisons. Whether they had succeeded, he could not know. But if such documents were being produced in Leipzig, then the city's printers and binders were no longer merely tools of propaganda. They were auxiliary agents in a shadow war of deception. It was then that Zahn made his quiet decision. For months, he had observed. He had collected. Now he would intervene. His rationale was not ideological. He was not a declared opponent of the regime, nor a member of any resistance network. But he understood the maps, their markings, and, crucially, the consequences of their misuse. If a resistance cell or a stranded Allied pilot acted on one of these corrupted guides, they could walk into an ambush or evade toward a location no longer secure. These were not just misprints. They were weapons. Zahn's plan was simple and deceptively quiet. He began inserting authentic fragments, scraps of real Allied maps that had come through his station, into the bindings of German propaganda materials destined for Allied territory. These were not prominently displayed. They were tucked between inner flyleaves, glued into spine folds, or hidden beneath false title pages. Only someone dismantling the document or thumbing through with care would find them. But if found, they would serve as a signal, a partial correction, a warning, a quiet code. This was not to be trusted. The first test came with a batch of leaflets marked for aerial drop over eastern France. These bore the standard claims: Britain would abandon the continent, the Americans were delaying landings, the Germans would ensure European sovereignty. But Zahn, reviewing the binding sheets, recognized a map fragment slated for discard. A partial RAF navigation overlay showing a corridor used by Allied aircraft over the Vosges. The overlay was real. It had been marked for incineration due to a glue spill. Instead, Zahn trimmed the damaged corner, folded it flat, and bound it into the rear hinge of a propaganda booklet, where it would remain invisible unless the document was fully opened. He repeated the process again weeks later, using a misaligned fragment of a French regional map showing abandoned train depots, locations that had already been repurposed by German units and were falsely labeled in the printed German reproductions. The fragment, when folded and inserted, did not directly contradict the map's main content. But for a reader with local knowledge, the inconsistency would raise questions. Zahn was not transmitting information nor leaking documents. He was seeding doubt. Over time, his technique improved. He chose fragments with care, ensuring they would not trace back to him. Some were incomplete but telling: a torn legend here, a corner fold with a station name misaligned. Others were sections cut from duplicate prints slated for recycling. No two insertions were the same. He never used material from outside the shop. And he never discussed the process, not with his wife, not with his co-workers, not even in a journal. The risk was ever present. If discovered, he would be accused not of sabotage, but of espionage, perhaps even aiding the enemy. No distinction would be made between motive and method. The propaganda ministry and the Gestapo above it tolerated no deviation in wartime production. Even minor irregularities drew inspection. One close call came in September. A junior officer from Berlin arrived for a spot check on batch consistency. While reviewing leaflet weights and binding alignments, he noticed that a handful of copies from Zahn's table felt marginally thicker than others. Zahn, calm and deliberate, offered to rebind the entire subbatch himself to ensure compliance. The officer, in a hurry, allowed it. That night, Zahn removed the embedded fragment and burned it in his stove. He never reused the same insertion technique twice. Outside, the war intensified. The Allies had invaded Sicily and were pushing up through Italy. British and American bombers were reaching deeper into German territory. Leipzig's skies, once untroubled, now sounded more frequently with sirens. In October, an overnight raid struck the outskirts of the city, damaging several factories. Zahn's own workshop was spared, but another binder's shop, one that had shared transport crates with his, was reduced to rubble. Amid the shifting front lines and deepening paranoia, Zahn continued his work, quiet, methodical, and increasingly personal. What had begun as professional curiosity had evolved into moral calculation. His craft, once devoted to preserving knowledge, had been repurposed for distortion. And now, by imperceptible degrees, he was using it to tilt the balance back, not with sabotage, but with precision, with folded paper, with silence, with doubt. By early 1944, Leipzig no longer existed at a comfortable remove from the war. The city had endured its first sustained Allied air raids, and the printing districts along the outskirts suffered intermittent damage. Power outages disrupted production schedules. Paper shortages became acute. Entire print runs were canceled or delayed as materials were redirected to military field manuals and emergency communications. Within this strain, oversight intensified rather than relaxed. The Reich Ministry of Propaganda responded to disruption with tighter control. Civilian workers involved in any form of publication were subjected to renewed background checks. Security officers rotated more frequently through production floors. Binders and printers were ordered to account for scrap paper by weight, not by estimate. Even long-serving craftsmen like Wilhelm Zahn were no longer assumed reliable by default. Reliability had become a variable, not a credential. Zahn adapted with practiced restraint. He reduced his insertions further, spacing them weeks apart. He limited himself to fragments so small that their absence from waste tallies would not register. His earlier confidence, never overt, gave way to caution. The purpose remained unchanged: to seed quiet contradictions within documents meant to deceive, to offer unintended readers a chance to doubt the material in their hands. But the cost of error had increased. That cost became evident in February. A shipment of propaganda booklets, bound at Zahn's facility and dropped over western France, was intercepted by German counterintelligence. The interception was not accidental. The crate had been diverted after reports from the field suggested irregularities. The documents themselves were unremarkable at first glance. But one booklet, when fully dismantled during inspection, revealed an unexpected internal layer, an unaccounted-for folded sheet embedded beneath the spine lining. The fragment was small, partial, and incomplete. It showed only a section of a rail junction near Angers, with markings inconsistent with the printed map included elsewhere in the booklet. To an untrained observer, it might have appeared as nothing more than a production error. To counterintelligence, it suggested something else: interference. An inquiry followed. It did not begin in Leipzig. It began in Paris, where German intelligence units were already under pressure from resistance sabotage and Allied reconnaissance. Field officers, increasingly suspicious of their own materials, forwarded the anomaly up the chain. By early March, a directive arrived in Berlin calling for a review of all propaganda production methods involving embedded materials. The response was bureaucratic but unforgiving. Production facilities were ordered to suspend hybrid publications, documents combining narrative text with cartographic inserts, until further notice. A task force was formed to audit recent print runs and trace their origins. Leipzig, with its volume and centrality, was placed under special review. Zahn learned of the inquiry indirectly. A supervisor, unusually tight-lipped, informed the staff that all waste handling procedures were to be revised immediately. Scrap paper was to be shredded on site. Bindery offcuts were to be incinerated daily under supervision. Workers were prohibited from removing any material from the premises, regardless of purpose. The environment changed almost overnight. Uniformed inspectors appeared without notice. Conversations on the floor grew clipped. Familiar routines, shared lunches, casual exchanges about paper stock or binding techniques, fell away. Each worker was aware that the review was not a formality. Someone, somewhere, had disrupted the system. And until identified, everyone was suspect. Zahn was questioned twice. The first interview was procedural. A security officer reviewed his employment record, asked about his previous military service, and inquired whether he had ever traveled outside Germany since 1939. Zahn answered plainly. He had not. The second interview, conducted weeks later, was more pointed. He was asked whether he had ever noticed irregularities in print materials or binding components. He replied that errors occurred frequently under wartime conditions, especially with reduced quality controls. This was true. No accusation was made. None was needed. The unspoken pressure was sufficient. Meanwhile, the effects of Zahn's earlier actions, if they were indeed his, had begun to surface in indirect ways. German field reports from occupied France and Belgium noted an increase in Allied caution regarding found documents. Units reported that resistance groups were no longer acting on captured German materials as readily. In several cases, Allied units bypassed false supply depots that had been expected to draw attention. German intelligence attributed this to improved Allied discipline and growing skepticism, not to internal compromise. Zahn read none of these reports. He only heard fragments, passed down through supervisors or mentioned obliquely during inspections. But the pattern was clear enough. The deception campaigns were losing effectiveness. Whether due to exposure, adaptation, or simple overuse, the materials were no longer achieving their intended results. Within the propaganda ministry, this failure provoked retaliation, not against the enemy, but inward. Blame was distributed broadly. Production quotas were raised. Error tolerances were lowered. Workers were warned that negligence would be treated as sabotage. In April, one printer from a neighboring facility was arrested after a misprint was found in a batch of Dutch-language pamphlets. The error was linguistic, not operational. It did not matter. The message was understood. Zahn ceased all insertions. The decision was not ideological. It was practical. The space for quiet interference had closed. The system had become too rigid, too monitored. Any further deviation, however small, would be reckless. Zahn dismantled his false drawer and burned its contents over several nights, reducing years of fragments to ash. He kept nothing. The memory would have to suffice. The war, by then, was pressing in from all sides. In June, news of the Allied landings in Normandy reached Leipzig in fragmented form, rumors first, then official communiques carefully framed as temporary setbacks. Production demands shifted again. Propaganda now focused inward, aimed at German civilians rather than foreign audiences. Leipzig's presses were tasked with printing morale leaflets, emergency directives, and evacuation notices. Zahn's role narrowed. He bound fewer maps, more notices, more instructional booklets. The materials were dull, repetitive, and heavy with denial. There were no more layered documents, no more hybrid publications. The deception war had given way to blunt assertion. Security relaxed slightly, not from trust but from overload. Zahn continued to report to work, perform his tasks, and return home. He did not speak of what he had done. There was no audience for it, and no protection in confession. What remained was a growing awareness of proximity, how close he had come to detection, how narrow the margin had been. The quiet acts were over. The consequences, however, were still unfolding beyond his view. By the winter of 1944, Leipzig bore the visible marks of a collapsing war economy. Entire districts had been damaged or abandoned. Print houses that once operated continuously now functioned sporadically, dependent on erratic power and dwindling paper supplies. The propaganda ministry's reach, once expansive and methodical, had narrowed to immediate necessities, evacuation orders, ration notices, and internal directives meant to preserve order rather than influence events beyond Germany's borders. Wilhelm Zahn remained at his post through these final months, though his work had changed almost entirely. The complex hybrid documents, maps concealed within narratives, layered materials intended to mislead, no longer arrived. What passed through his hands now were plain notices, training booklets for Volkssturm units, and simplified instructional manuals hastily assembled for a population unprepared for the war's final phase. There was no longer room for subtlety, nor interest in elaborate deception. The environment of suspicion eased, not because trust returned, but because surveillance capacity was strained elsewhere. Security personnel were reassigned to protect infrastructure or enforce evacuations. Inspections became infrequent. By February 1945, several supervisory offices in Leipzig were vacant, their occupants transferred or missing. The system that had once monitored every scrap of paper now struggled to maintain basic control. Zahn's earlier actions were never revisited. The inquiry initiated the previous year had quietly dissolved amid larger crises. No formal conclusions were issued. No individual was identified or punished in relation to the embedded map fragments. In the absence of proof, and with priorities shifting rapidly, the matter was simply absorbed into the growing mass of unresolved wartime irregularities. Outside Leipzig, the war's trajectory was unmistakable. Allied forces crossed the Rhine. Soviet armies advanced relentlessly from the east. German propaganda increasingly contradicted observable reality. For Zahn, who had spent years working at the intersection of image and information, this collapse was not sudden. It was the logical conclusion of a system that had come to rely on distortion as routine. In April, Leipzig was encircled. The city surrendered without prolonged fighting. American forces entered from the west, encountering sporadic resistance but little coordinated defense. Zahn remained at home during the occupation's first days, emerging only when local authorities instructed civilians to report for registration. His workshop had survived, though many nearby buildings had not. The presses were silent. Occupation authorities conducted initial sweeps of industrial facilities, including printing and publishing houses. Their focus was pragmatic, identifying useful equipment, locating remaining stocks, and cataloging personnel. Zahn was interviewed once by an American officer accompanied by a German interpreter. The questions concerned his trade, his years of service, and whether he had been a member of the Nazi Party. He answered truthfully. He had not been. No further inquiries followed. The Allied occupation brought with it a different relationship to printed material. Maps were now openly shared among military units. Captured German documents were analyzed systematically, no longer feared as traps but treated as artifacts of a defeated system. Zahn observed this shift indirectly, through discarded papers left behind by occupation offices and through conversations with other craftsmen now seeking civilian work. Only gradually did fragments of a larger picture emerge. In the years immediately after the war, Allied intelligence summaries, some published, others circulated informally among historians and archivists, made brief reference to a phenomenon noted during the later stages of the conflict: inconsistencies in German propaganda materials recovered in occupied territories. Some documents, analysts observed, contained internal contradictions or embedded elements that appeared to undermine their own messaging. In certain cases, authentic Allied cartographic fragments had been found within otherwise fabricated publications. These references were not prominent. They appeared as footnotes, anomalies, or unresolved observations. No source was identified. No individual was credited. The prevailing conclusion was that these irregularities resulted from production chaos, mismanagement, or unintended errors during Germany's final years. Zahn read one such reference years later, in a post-war journal borrowed from a colleague. He did not react outwardly. The passage made no claims, assigned no responsibility, and offered no speculation beyond institutional failure. It aligned comfortably with official narratives. That was sufficient. Zahn never attempted to correct the record. After the war, he resumed his private restoration work full-time. Leipzig's publishing industry slowly rebuilt under new political authority, but Zahn avoided large contracts. He specialized in repairing damaged pre-war volumes, religious texts, atlases, and regional histories. His interest in maps persisted, though now it was openly academic. He collected post-war reprints, compared editions, and followed changes in borders with the detached focus of a craftsman observing continuity and loss. He spoke little about the war. When asked, he described himself as a bookbinder who had done his job under difficult circumstances. This was accurate. He did not frame his actions as resistance, nor did he attach moral weight to them when speaking privately. There had been no organization, no coordination, no assurance of effect. Only a series of small, deliberate choices made within a constrained system. From an institutional perspective, his actions left no trace. The propaganda ministry files that might have recorded internal audits were destroyed or lost. Gestapo records from Leipzig were incomplete. Allied intelligence assessments focused on outcomes, not origins. The war's documentation favored large movements, named officials, and formal resistance networks. A civilian craftsman working alone in a bindery did not register. Yet the quiet legacy remained, dispersed and indirect. Allied field units had learned to distrust certain recovered materials sooner than expected. Resistance groups adjusted their behavior. Intelligence officers noted anomalies that contributed, among many other factors, to a broader skepticism toward enemy-produced documents. No single fragment caused this shift. No individual could be credited. The effect, if any, was cumulative and untraceable. Zahn lived into old age. He never received recognition, nor did he seek it. There were no medals, no testimonies, no post-war interviews. His name appears nowhere in official accounts of intelligence operations or resistance activity. When he died in the late 1960s, his papers contained nothing related to the war beyond standard employment records and a modest collection of maps dating from various periods. What remains of his story survives only as inference. It survives in the unexplained inconsistencies noted by analysts, in the absence of attribution, in the possibility that within a system designed to control information absolutely, one craftsman used precision and restraint to introduce uncertainty, not to redirect the course of the war, but to complicate its machinery. The record does not elevate such acts. History often overlooks them entirely.